Greetings, AP Euro scholars, for our review, Unit 13 on the Cold War up to the fall of communism and the creation of the European Union, all after 1945, the end of World War II, which was our last unit. Okay, the Cold War, period of rivalry and hostility between democratic free market West against totalitarian communist nations, basically the U.S. against the USSR, and our allies in Western Europe, including Canada, against the USSR and its satellite nations that communism was forced onto. And later, after 1949, when China falls to Mao, it would also be us against the communist Chinese. The Iron Curtain is a metaphor used by Winston Churchill, describing the division in Europe between the West and the East, between the free West and the communist Eastern Europe. And this is the period following World War II, where the Red Army does not leave its liberated areas. The Yalta Agreement, the thing you need to know about the Yalta Agreement concerning the Cold War is that Stalin promises at this meeting in the Crimea that he will allow free elections in Eastern Europe. Instead, he imposes communism through bogus elections on East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. Also, Yugoslavia and Albania go communist, and Stalin swallows up the three Baltic states. Characteristics of communism. Communism is not democratic. There are no civil liberties. You have no free speech, no freedom to worship, no free assembly. Communism is officially atheistic. There's no private ownership of the means of production. There's censorship. There's secret police. There's no trials, no jury. You have prison without jury and conviction. You have slave labor. You have propaganda. You have indoctrination. You have cult of personality. Communism is sort of antithetical to free enterprise democracy. George Kennan and the idea of containment. Kennan is an American diplomat in Moscow who, in his famous long telegram, outlines this policy of containment, where he says the Soviets are duplicitous, they're liars, they're aggressive, and they only understand one thing, and that's force. And they do not seek peace by definition. Communism is expansionist, and he says the United States needs to basically keep its military in Western Europe. And this leads to the creation of NATO in 1949. These are the free nations of Western Europe, including the US and Canada, which enter a military alliance. Later, the Soviets and their lackeys make up what's called the Warsaw Pact. And that falls apart as soon as the Soviet Union lets the foot off the neck of these countries. And just kind of maybe a little complexity thing here, this is very contrary to, of course, the advice of essentially a century of American isolationism following Washington's proclamation of neutrality. The European Recovery Act, also called the Marshall Plan, this is 1948, and the big reason here is 3 years after the war, Western Europe is still flattened. It is economically dead. It has a horrible winter, 47 through 48. People are despairing. There's joblessness, there's unemployment. There is very low production. And the communists are basically saying to the West Europeans, see how great the U.S. system here is for you. We have cred. We've defeated the Nazis. We have a system where everyone has a job, and go communist. And the communists are winning in free elections about a 30% or so of the vote in both France and in Italy. So the United States is going to pump money into Western Europe for a number of reasons. One is to stop the spread of communism. One is to revive trade between the Western Europeans and the United States. And also there is a altruistic charitable component here. Soviet accusations against the U.S. and Europe and evidence showing this, well, they're arguing that it's the United States, that we're the instigators of trouble, that we are keeping bases, that we are keeping soldiers in West Europe. We're trying to bind the Europeans to us, and we're recreating West Germany. Remember, Germans invade Russia twice, killing tens of millions. And the very recreation of a free German state is a provocation to the Germans, or to the Russians, especially under Stalin, who has no intention of ever, reviving Germany. One of the arguments, essentially, of the Russians, it's not an argument, it's a reason for the enslavement of Eastern Europe, is they don't care one whit about the rights of these Eastern Europeans. The main goal of Russian foreign policy is to push Germany as far away as possible. And to that end, the borders of Poland and Germany are pushed to the west. Germany will lose territory, as does Poland. The Truman Doctrine's response to Soviet threats against Greece and Turkey. There is a civil war going on in Greece, and the Truman Doctrine gives $400 million in aid to the Greeks and the Turks. And the Truman Doctrine says we will aid any country fighting subjugation by armed minorities, and you should read into that communists. The Berlin blockade and airlift from 48 to 49. The reason here again is Germany has, West Germany, the zones in West Germany, the American, French, and Brit zones, are being combined into a new German nation with an independent currency. And the Russians don't want this. The Russians want us out of West Berlin, which is completely surrounded by East Germany. And, the Russians are mad at us. And they basically are willing to starve a city of, about 1 million or so refugees into submission. And our response to the Soviets cutting off the road, cutting off the railroad routes from the west through Eastern Germany to West Berlin, is we have an airlift. And we do this for about a year. And eventually the Russians relent. The Cold War in Asia, you should know about the Korean and the Vietnam War. The Cold War in Latin America, you should know that Cuba becomes communist, and you also have the U.S. CIA working to help overthrow the government of Guatemala in 1954, which is in the process of nationalizing U.S. fruit company lands. The Cold War in the Middle East and Africa. Be aware that during the 1956 Suez Crisis, where Egypt has taken over the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal is invaded by the French and British armies, as well as Israel, the USSR is agitating on this, or is threatening to intervene on the side of Egypt. The United States has no intention of supporting European colonialism and getting into a World War III over Egypt and the Suez Canal. So the United States pretty much pulls the leash on the Brits and the French. They're very dependent on American aid. In fact, the British have rationing for 9 years after World War II, for example. They are broke. They're dependent on American largesse. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, the Soviets put long-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy starts a blockade, which we call a quarantine, to sort of force the Russians to pull their missiles out, and we allow them to save some face here behind the scenes. We promise to pull missiles out of Turkey and to never invade Cuba. Of course, this later will cost Khrushchev his job, and he'll be replaced with Leonid Brezhnev. Khrushchev's secret speech when he comes into power after the death of Stalin in 1953. In 1956, Khrushchev is going to give a talk to the whatever the Soviet Congress is called, and he's condemning the cult of personality of Stalin. He's condemning Stalin's crimes against socialism. He's doing the unthinkable. He's speaking against Stalin, and he's saying that wrong has been done in this communist system, and it's a statement against terrorism. It's a statement that says the government will focus more on the needs, especially the consumer good needs of individuals. And this is going to inspire other communist countries to loosen up, especially in 1956. You have the Hungarian Revolution. And they're basically telling, at this point, they're telling the Soviets they want to be non-aligned. They don't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact. They want freedom from censorship and free speech and religion. And Russia will invade. And you have about, I want to say about 400,000 arrested, and about 250,000 will flee for their lives, thousands killed under the treads of Warsaw Pact as in Russian tanks that invade. 1968, same thing here. You have what's called the Prague Spring. You have in Czechoslovakia, you have reform under Alexander Dubček, who's allowing free speech, free press, travel privileges, and the Soviets will invade once again in 1968. Lots of similarity to the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. 1960 U-2 incident. Soviets shoot down a U.S. spy plane, U-2 plane, over the Soviet Union, capturing Francis Gary Powers. This is the subject of that movie Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. If you've seen that, you know about the U-2 incident. The Brezhnev Doctrine. This is going to be the justification for the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Basically, Leonid Brezhnev says that no country is allowed to change its political system. No communist country is allowed to stop being communist. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why now? Well, the USSR under Mikhail Gorbachev is unwilling to use force, like in 1956 in Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia. So without the Soviet backing, there's not the will in East Germany to basically keep, killing the hundreds of people who have tried over the years to go over the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall will open up, and then it will literally come down before the eyes of TV audiences as big, heavy equipment starts knocking these big concrete towers over. It's the beginning of the fall of communism, 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev, he's the last of the Soviet presidents, and he is going to try to sort of last-ditch revive communism to be a system that will benefit the people. He allows perestroika, which is economic restructuring, allowing people to have their own little businesses and little restaurants and shops and stores. And this is going to begin the unraveling of this unproductive, inefficient, disliked economic system. And glasnost is openness, is allowing political speech and press. And there's going to be votes within the Communist Party, and then non-communist parties are going to be allowed to vote. And Russia, all the republics, and eventually Russia itself, will vote independence from the Soviet Union, which will fall in 1991. Basically, the Soviet Union will implode from within by a massive vote of no confidence through all these republics pulling out. Lech Walesa has this, it's W-A-L-E-S-A. I'm not sure why it's pronounced this way. It's, it's a Polish pronunciation. But Lech Walesa is the leader of the Solidarity Party, which starts out as a union. He's an electrician in the shipyards at Gdansk. And this trade union is going to go on strike. It's going to spread into a nationwide rejection against the communist government until martial law is declared under General Jaruzelski. And Lech is going to be thrown into prison for a few years. And this Soviets come very close to invading. So it's kind of a little editorial or just a notice here. Jaruzelski died a few years ago. And the Poles don't really know what to do with him. Is he a hero for kind of jumping in front of the Soviets and stopping solidarity before the Soviets could invade? Or is he basically a tool of the Soviets, sort of freezing the independence, the democratization that had begun under Solidarity? But Lech eventually becomes the president of a free Poland in June 1989. The Poles argue that they had their free election before the wall fell in East Germany or East Berlin. The war in Yugoslavia. In 1991 through 94, when the rest of communist Europe is rejecting communism, the Yugoslav republics, one by one, will declare their independence from the larger Serb-dominated Yugoslavia. In Slovenia, the first country, or the first republic that pulls out and declares itself to be an independent country, there's a short 10-day war. A much longer war takes place between the Croatians and the Serbs. Remember the nasty, the killing that took place, especially Croats against the Serbs. The Croats worked hand in hand with the Nazis, killed about 100,000 Serbs during World War II. The Croats and the Serbs will ethnic cleanse each other's countries. The Croats will kick out Serbs, and Serbs will kick out Croats. Movement of hundreds of thousands of refugees stay on the ground, get their freedom. And in a crazy twist here, Croatia will join with Serbia in an attack on Bosnia, which declares its independence. Bosnia has a very large Muslim population. They're adjacent to Muslim, or former Muslim Albania. And this war it's going to see about 100,000 dead. There's going to be the biggest mass murder since World War II in a place called Srebrenica by a Serb militia against these townspeople in Bosnia. There's going to be mass rape, something like 50,000 women systematically raped, the Serbs deliberately terrorizing the Bosnians, and millions of refugees, both internally and fleeing abroad. And this war ends with the Dayton Agreement, which is hammered out under Bill Clinton in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And the war ends with there being one Bosnia essentially divided into 3 zones. And basically there's a Serb republic, really recognized only by Serbia, but the war does come to an end with intervention by NATO. I should mention that NATO does intervene. Serbia gets bombed. American boots are on the ground here. And before this, there's a very ineffectual UN peacekeeping mission, and the UN soldiers basically are sort of sissies. They get captured by the Serbs and chained to fences and stuff. All right, Yugoslavia was created initially by the Versailles Conference. Balfour Declaration 1917 is a promise for a Jewish nation-state in Palestine, which Great Britain will acquire through the mandate system at the end of World War II via the League of Nations. And Israel will be created in 1948. It will receive approval by the UN. They will jump ahead and declare their own independence, and they will be invaded by 5 Arab countries, and they will win. They will win their independence. And there's a lot of sympathy after World War II to give the Jews a homeland, especially after Western guilt over the Holocaust. Factors leading to post-World War II decolonization. Well, first of all, the European rhetoric of freedom. They fought a war for democracy, for freedom, for self-determination. 2, the weakness of the Europeans after World War II. You see this in the Suez Crisis, where the Americans are calling the shots, not the Brits or French anymore. They don't have the ability to project power. They're out of money. If the Americans say go home, you got to go home. When the Americans threaten the Brits with economic punishment while they're at the Suez, the British sterling, the British pound is going to plummet in value. So their economies would have the are just weak after World War II. Thirdly, you have native nationalist movements led by people like Mohandas Gandhi in India, and then you have support by other third world countries, and especially by the communists. Communists will support a lot of these movements against capitalist imperialism. Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher. After World War II, you have, in an election, a lot of people don't know this, Winston Churchill is tossed out of office. Clement Attlee is a Labour Party leader who wins this election. He's a democratic socialist, and the steel mills, the coal mines, the railroads, the healthcare system are going to be taken over by the socialists here in Great Britain. Years later, sort of contemporary with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, a conservative Tory, is going to either privatize or shut down a lot of these privatized industries, and she's going to turn back the clock quite a bit. Not entirely. You do have the National Health Service, which remains, but a lot of private housing, a lot of factories, the railroads, a lot of these things are, I don't know about the railroads, but a lot of the factories and mines are either privatized or shut down because they're not profitable, they're not competitive at this point in history. You should know what goes into the creation of the European Union, this attempt to make kind of an economic United States of Europe. It starts with the European coal and steel community after the war. The goal here is to integrate the economies of 6 nations to promote trade and economic growth. And these will be the 3 Benelux countries and the Germans, the French, and the Italians. This will evolve under the Treaty of Rome into a larger group called the European Economic Community, also called the Common Market. And the goals here are economic prosperity, free trade, getting rid of tariffs and custom barriers, being able to move stuff back and forth across borders freely to make Europeans more prosperous. But underneath this is a deeper goal, and that is to stop any future World War I or IIs. Have the Europeans be so interdependent on each other, be so wealthy, be so happy with their economic state of being that they won't remotely think of going to war against each other. And this has been wildly successful, really beyond people's memory of what happened before the 1970 Treaty of Rome. So the goal here is to keep the peace and to create prosperity. Currently, the EU has, after the Maastricht Treaty, the EU's created out of the EEC, and the EU has one currency, this euro, and there's 28 members of the EU, but there's only 19 of them will use the euro. For example, Great Britain still uses the pound. But the EU is this attempt to have more economic prosperity. In the Schengen area, 26 European countries have abolished passport controls at their borders. And one of the reasons for Brexit a few years ago was the fear of terrorists and all these immigrants from North Africa and the Muslim and Middle East sort of flooding into Europe. And under the EU and Schengen agreement, the English were supposed to take a certain number of these immigrants. And there's been a lot of Muslim terrorism in Europe, and the Schengen area allows this free movement of people, including immigrants. So this has been very controversial. We'll get more into this in our last unit. All right, signing out, guys. Good luck. Study hard, study early, study smart. Bye.